Tokyo, 1942. In smoke-filled strategy rooms, Japanese generals laughed at American war plans. Amphibious assaults? Across thousands of miles of open ocean? Impossible, they said. The Americans, they believed, were soft, too comfortable, too clumsy to fight on distant islands surrounded by coral reefs and machine gun nests. But 2 years later, those same generals watched in silence as one island after another fell. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The ocean they thought protected them became a highway of invasion. And by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. This is how the U.S. Marines rewrote the art of war, one brutal landing at a time. Act 1. Arrogance before the storm. The rising sun ascendant. December 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy paraded through Tokyo Bay with flags snapping in the winter wind. Officers stood on decks, chests swollen with pride. They had reason to celebrate. In 6 months, they had conquered more territory than Napoleon ever dreamed of. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Half the Pacific Ocean now flew the rising sun. American forces? Scattered, humiliated, running. At Wake Island, a handful of Marines had held out for 2 weeks before being overwhelmed. In the Philippines, General MacArthur fled in the night, leaving 70,000 men to surrender at Bataan, the largest capitulation in American military history. The footage told the story Japanese propagandists wanted. American prisoners, exhausted and defeated, marching into captivity. The scorn of empire. In the Imperial Navy's Staff College, instructors dismissed American amphibious capabilities with a wave of the hand. Lieutenant Commander Chihaya Takahashi wrote in his tactical assessment, "The Americans possess neither the spiritual fortitude nor the technical expertise for sustained amphibious operations across the Pacific. Their culture of comfort has made them weak." They had studied American doctrine. They knew the U.S. Marine Corps had only conducted small-scale landing exercises in the Caribbean. Nothing approached the scale of what would be required to retake the Pacific. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. To land troops on an island, you needed 3-to-1 numerical superiority at minimum. But how do you achieve that across 3,000 miles of open ocean? How do you supply an invasion force when the nearest friendly port is weeks away? The Japanese had fortified their island chains with interlocking defenses. Concrete bunkers, artillery pre-sighted on every beach, machine guns positioned to create crossfire zones where nothing could survive. Let them try, the generals thought. Let them come. The ocean will swallow them whole. The sleeping giant stirs. But in Hawaii, in the shadow of sunken battleships, something was changing. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood over maps in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, plotting a counteroffensive that seemed insane. His staff looked at him with barely concealed doubt. "Guadalcanal," Nimitz said, tapping the map. "We take it, we hold it, and we show them we can fight." The island was barely a speck in the Solomon chain, but it had what mattered: a nearly completed Japanese airfield that could threaten the supply lines to Australia. In training camps across New Zealand and Hawaii, Marines practiced climbing down cargo nets into small boats. The Higgins boat, a simple plywood craft with a front ramp, was their only ticket to shore. They had never used them in combat. No one had tested the radios under fire. The doctrine was written in peacetime by men who'd never seen a beach under artillery fire. One Marine corporal wrote home, "We're supposed to hit a beach next month. Half of us don't know if the boats will even make it to shore, but I guess we're about to find out. The training was frantic, chaotic, desperate, but it was training nonetheless. And the Japanese weren't training at all. They were celebrating victories they assumed would last forever. Act 2. Guadalcanal. The test. 6:00 hours to 1300 hours. Dawn, August 7th, 1942. The darkness before dawn hung over Iron Bottom Sound like a held breath. 11,000 Marines crowded into transport ships, their faces pale in the red battle lights below deck. Most had never seen combat. Some were teenagers who'd lied about their age to enlist. They checked their rifles obsessively. They wrote last letters. They vomited into buckets as the ships rolled in the swells. At 6:13 hours, the naval bombardment began. Cruisers and destroyers unleashed everything they had at the jungle-covered ridgelines of Guadalcanal. The thunder rolled across the water. Fire bloomed on the hillsides. Then, silence. Away all boats. The Higgins boats dropped from the davits, smacking into the waves. Marines scrambled down cargo nets, weighted down with 60 pounds of gear. Some fell, some drowned before they ever reached a boat. The coxswains opened throttles. The invasion was on. Chaos on Red Beach. What they found wasn't what they expected. The Japanese construction crews, engineers not soldiers, had fled into the jungle at the first sound of shells. The beach was empty. The half-built airfield was deserted. For 30 minutes, the Marines couldn't believe their luck. They'd expected hell. They'd gotten an abandoned construction site. But that luck wouldn't last. The supplies that never came. Within hours, the operation began to unravel. The cargo ships, spooked by reports of Japanese bombers, pulled out early. They took 80% of the Marine supplies with them: food, ammunition, medical equipment, radio batteries. On the beach, crates of supplies sat in the surf where they'd been dumped haphazardly. Some contained winter coats. In the tropics. Some contained typewriters. Some contained nothing but packing paper. There was no plan for this, no doctrine for sorting through chaos while enemy planes circled overhead. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, the commander, stood ankle-deep in salt water, watching his carefully planned invasion dissolve into improvisation. He said, "We'll make do. We always do." The nightmare begins. August 12th, midnight. The rain fell in sheets, turning the jungle into a black maze. Marines huddled in shallow foxholes, their rifles slick with mud. Then they heard it. Voices in the darkness. Hundreds of voices. Chanting, screaming. Japanese reinforcements had arrived under cover of darkness, delivered by destroyers that came and went before dawn. They came in waves, bayonets fixed, officers waving samurai swords. The Marines fired blind into the tree line. Muzzle flashes lit up faces twisted in fear and determination. Men killed each other at arm's length. The jungle amplified every sound. Screams, gunfire, the wet thump of bodies falling. By dawn, the Japanese assault had broken. Bodies lay tangled in the barbed wire. But the Marines knew the truth now. This wasn't going to be easy. This was going to be hell. Henderson Field. But they held. Week after week, under bombardment and counterattack, they held. The airfield, now called Henderson Field, became operational. Marine pilots flew battered fighters off its muddy runway, intercepting Japanese bombers during the day. At night, Japanese destroyers, the Tokyo Express, would race down the slot, bombarding the airfield and landing reinforcements. The Marines learned to dig deeper, to sleep in shifts, to survive on half rations and adrenaline. A Marine private wrote in his diary, "We learned fast, or we died fast. There was no third option. The Japanese didn't understand what they were seeing. Their intelligence reports spoke of American forces on the verge of collapse. Any day now, the Marines would break, but they didn't break. The withdrawal. February 1943. After 6 months of brutal fighting, the Japanese withdrew from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. In Tokyo, the loss was spun as a strategic redeployment, but the commanders knew better. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan had been forced to retreat. The Americans, the soft, undisciplined Americans, had won. More importantly, they had learned. Every mistake at Guadalcanal was studied. Every failure was analyzed. The Marines compiled after-action reports hundreds of pages long, breaking down what worked and what didn't. The next landing would be different. The next landing would be worse. Act 3. Forged in Blood, Tarawa. 1,300 hours, 2,000 hours. The Perfect Fortress. BTO Island, Tarawa Atoll, November 1943. From the air, it looked like nothing, a thin strip of coral and sand barely 300 acres in size. You could walk its length in 20 minutes. But Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had turned it into a fortress. 4,000 Japanese troops occupied 800 pillboxes and bunkers made of steel-reinforced concrete, coconut logs, and coral. Every inch of the beach was pre-sighted for artillery and machine gun fire. Shibasaki told his men, 1,000,000 Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Americans gave themselves 3 days. D-Day, Tarawa, November 20th, 1943. The pre-landing bombardment was supposed to destroy everything. Battleships, cruisers, and bombers pounded BTO for hours. The island disappeared in smoke and flame. When the barrage lifted, officers in the command ship nodded to each other. Nothing could have survived that. But the bunkers had survived, the guns had survived, and now they waited. The reef. The first wave of Marines climbed into new amphibious tractors, LVTs, that could crawl over the coral reef surrounding the island. They made it to shore. The second and third waves weren't as lucky. They came in Higgins boats that couldn't clear the reef. The tide was lower than predicted. The boats grounded 700 yards from shore. The Marines had a choice: stay in the boats and die, or jump into chest-deep water and wade through 700 yards of machine gun fire. They jumped. The water churned with bullets. Men fell face first into the lagoon, their packs dragging them under. Some made it 50 yards, some made it 20. Some never made it at all. One platoon of 45 Marines took 42 casualties before reaching the beach. The beach itself was no refuge. It was a 3-foot seawall made of coconut logs, and beyond it, the Japanese bunkers were still intact, their guns still firing. 76 hours. For 3 days and 3 nights, Marines fought bunker to bunker, yard by yard. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades thrown into firing slits. When explosives didn't work, they sealed bunkers shut and moved on. The heat was unbearable. Bodies swelled in the sun. The smell became part of the air you breathed. Combat correspondent Robert Sherrod, who landed with the Marines, wrote, "I've never seen such faces. These men had looked at death so long they had forgotten what life was." By November 23rd, the island was secure. Cost: 1,000 Marines dead, 2,000 wounded. An island 1 mile long and 500 yards wide. The American public reacts. When footage of Tarawa reached the United States, the nation recoiled in horror. Newsreels showed beaches carpeted with bodies. Letters to Congress demanded to know why so many men had died for a tiny island no one had ever heard of. But the military learned different lessons. They learned that pre-landing bombardment needed to be longer and more accurate. They learned that tides and reefs had to be scouted obsessively. They learned that LVTs were essential, and they needed hundreds more. Most importantly, they learned that Japanese defensive doctrine was predictable. The bunkers were always positioned the same way. The firing patterns never changed. The Japanese had built their perfect defense and then stopped innovating. The Americans, meanwhile, were just getting started. Tokyo's disbelief. Intercepted Japanese communications told a different story than their propaganda. One staff officer wrote, "The American landing at Tarawa demonstrated tactical capabilities we did not believe they possessed. Their use of specialized amphibious vehicles, coordinated naval gunfire, and continuous reinforcement under fire suggests a level of preparation and adaptability that contradicts our previous assessments." Another report was more direct. "We may have underestimated them." But the die was cast. The Japanese strategy was to dig deeper, build stronger bunkers, fight to the last man. They would make every island cost more than the last. They didn't realize the Americans weren't trying to avoid casualties, they were trying to learn. And with every landing, they learned faster. Act 4. The machine advances. 20 minutes to 26 minutes. The island-hopping juggernaut. By 1944, the American war machine in the Pacific had become something the world had never seen. Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each name marked another step closer to Japan. And each assault was more efficient, more coordinated, more unstoppable than the last. At Saipan, 70,000 Marines and Army troops landed across 8 beaches simultaneously. A floating logistics network supplied them with everything they needed: food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, delivered to the beach within hours of request. What once took weeks now took days. What once seemed impossible now seemed routine. The Seabees War. Behind every landing was an army of engineers, the Navy construction battalions, the Seabees. They built floating causeways that let trucks drive directly from ships to shore. They constructed instant harbors from pontoons and steel. They bulldozed jungle airstrips into operation while bullets still flew overhead. On Tinian, Seabees had a bomber one-way operational 36 hours after the Marines secured the island. Within weeks, B-29 super fortresses were taking off to bomb Japan itself. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a barrier. It had become America's highway. Precision and brutality. The doctrine was perfected now. Every landing followed the same playbook. Naval and air bombardment, days, not hours. Underwater demolition teams, Navy frogmen, scouted beaches and cleared obstacles before the first wave landed. LVTs delivered the assault troops directly to shore. Artillery and air support responded to requests within minutes. At Peleliu, a single Marine forward observer called in naval gunfire from a battleship 12 miles offshore, dropping 15-inch shells on a Japanese bunker with terrifying accuracy. The coordination was mathematical, industrial, relentless. But it was never easy. It was never clean. The cost of mastery. At Iwo Jima, Marines spent 36 days fighting over 8 square miles of volcanic ash. Every yard was earned in blood. 70,000 Marines landed. 27,000 became casualties. The Japanese had learned to dig deeper. Three-story bunkers connected by tunnels, invisible from the air, impervious to bombardment. But the Americans had learned to be patient, to burn them out, to bury them alive when they had to. Victory was inevitable now, but that didn't make it any less terrible. A Marine corporal on Iwo Jima wrote to his sister, "We win every battle now. We've gotten good at this. But I don't feel proud anymore. I just feel tired, so tired." The Japanese perspective. In Tokyo, Imperial headquarters received reports that read like obituaries. Enemy forces landed at 7:30 a.m., island defenses overwhelmed by 1,400 hours. American amphibious coordination now exceeds all previous estimates. Recommend immediate. Recommend what? There were no recommendations left, no strategies that hadn't been tried and failed. One Japanese naval officer's diary, recovered after the war, contained a single entry from March 1945. They land where no man should be able to survive, and still they advance. We do not understand how this is possible. But the answer was simple. The Americans had learned, and the Japanese had not. Act 5. Collapse of an Empire. 26 minutes to 32 minutes. Okinawa, the last island. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War crashed ashore on Okinawa, only 350 miles from mainland Japan. 60,000 Marines and soldiers landed on the first day. By the end of the first week, over 100,000 troops were ashore, supported by a fleet of 1,500 ships. The Japanese didn't try to stop them at the beaches. They had learned that lesson too late. Instead, they waited in the interior, dug into the hills, prepared to bleed the Americans for every inch. It worked. For 82 days, the battle devoured men on both sides. Kamikaze pilots dove their planes into American ships with suicidal devotion. Japanese soldiers launched banzai charges that ended in piles of bodies. But the outcome was never in doubt. The realization. In the Imperial Palace, the reality was finally unavoidable. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal with confusion and improvisation. Now, 3 years later, they landed with the precision of a machine built for a single purpose. The ocean, Japan's greatest defensive barrier, had become worthless. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki stood before a map of the Pacific, marked with American arrows pointing at island after island. His voice was quiet. How did this happen? The answer was written in every after-action report, every tactical innovation, every lesson learned in blood. The Americans had been willing to learn, to change, to adapt faster than anyone thought possible. The Japanese had built their strategy on the assumption that their enemy would remain static. That assumption had been their downfall. The Atomic Shadow. August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The atomic bombs ended the war before the planned invasion of mainland Japan could begin, an invasion that would have been the largest amphibious assault in human history. Operation Downfall called for landing 5 million men on the Japanese home islands. The doctrine was ready, the ships were ready, the Marines were ready. They never had to go. But the capability existed, and that capability had been built on the lessons of every beach, every reef, every bunker from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. After the war. Reflections. Years later, military historians interviewed surviving Japanese commanders. Admiral Reizo Tanaka, who had fought at Guadalcanal, said, "We did not believe such a transformation was possible. We thought the Americans would give up after the first few defeats. We were wrong about everything. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, in a letter written before his death at Iwo Jima, wrote, "The Americans have shown an adaptability that defies our understanding of warfare. Every island teaches them. Every battle makes them stronger. We fight the same way each time. They never fight the same way twice." The legacy. The U.S. Marine Corps emerged from World War II as the world's premier amphibious warfare force. The doctrine they wrote in blood became the template for every nation's military. The Higgins boat became a symbol of American ingenuity. The lessons of Tarawa were taught in every military academy on Earth. But the cost was etched in stone. Memorials on islands across the Pacific carry tens of thousands of names, boys who learned to storm beaches and never came home. Final image. A beach on Okinawa, decades after the war. The water is blue and calm. Children play in the surf. Tourists take photos. Rusted metal still pokes through the sand, remnants of landing craft twisted and half buried. The waves wash over them, patient and eternal. Closing. The Pacific War taught one truth above all others. Arrogance sinks faster than ships. The Japanese believed the ocean protected them. They believed their enemy was weak, undisciplined, incapable of the sustained effort required to cross thousands of miles and storm fortified islands. They were wrong. The Americans arrived clumsy and uncertain. They made mistakes. They died by the thousands. But they learned. They adapted. They transformed. In 3 years, they turned amphibious warfare from theory into science, from desperation into doctrine. The Marines who stormed those beaches weren't superhuman. They were terrified boys who did the impossible because there was no other choice. And in doing so, they rewrote the rules of war itself. The Pacific would never be a barrier again.